This is part 2 of our consciousness chart, of our nerve flow chart, with the autonomic nervous system and visual signals. One thing I want to reiterate is these plot names don't indicate your mood or intention or the situation itself. They're just guidelines for how you can measure the level of activity of nerves from the autonomic nervous system and the visual signal. And some of these are pretty much synonyms in some cases, so they're relative in that regard. We left off at dissociation, and I already wrote this one down. It's adrenaline rush. This is when the autonomic nervous system is balanced and you're focused. You're in a rush. You'll notice a pretty consistent theme across rows and columns as they kind of progress into more extremes or to less extreme. In full fight mode, in focused visual system, we have what we can call no mind. No mind is a state of not overthinking, of being able to process the situation, again, more so with your body than with your mind, with your visual system. If you're more focused than the surge and the motivation, or if you have more fight response than the adrenaline rush, you get into this state very similar to clarity, but with more so your body, with your fight or flight response. This point here is special, but first we're going to talk about the circle that surrounds it, which is going to help us understand two things. We can call this psychosis, this sort of area around here. It's also to reiterate the level of innervation and how these points are relative to just helping us to locate the area or the levels that are increasing or decreasing in one or another aspect. So psychosis could cover, any range of nerve flow in this area. At the center here, we could call this the flow states. Now, depending on your definition and understanding of things, the flow state could be this whole region as well, or if you think of it only in terms of its most perfect or its most refined version, like a perfect flow state when the autonomic system is in balance and you're in a trance. Psychosis and the flow state, they are kind of two sides of the same coin, based mainly on how we tend to view things either negatively or positively. Something unique to a flow state is the fun that you're having and the intention behind it and seeing actual progress as well as overcoming a challenge. The flow state has been studied and it actually rejuvenates you. It's almost as if you had a full cycle of REM sleep during this state, which we can see it's kind of similar to the high, to the adrenaline rush, but it's a little bit more balanced in every aspect and something that helps you to overcome an obstacle, to get something done, and do so in a way that's kind of at your best version, your most balanced state. But this starts to get into how we view psychology, how we view psychological conditions and psychiatric disorders and whatnot. Psychosis is your response to an environmental condition or a situation. You enter it to tackle a problem, to overcome an obstacle, to meet a challenge. Part of the problem is when we don't have any way of actually achieving that, especially with a lot of societal factors or just personal factors that stop you from being able to actively participate in that problem solving, into that resolving of a situation, it instills in you or it conditions you in a sort of failure response. Part of the requirements of a flow state is to not be concerned about winning or losing. It's simply to enjoy the actual current situation in the moment. So psychosis in some sense is like an imperfect flow state. Too much parasympathetic activation and you have dissociation. Too much sympathetic activation and we could call this frantic or in a panic. You're in a trance, but you're overwhelmed. There's too much going on. You're overstimulated. In full trauma survival situations, we could call this the Berserker state. One thing you can start to do with all this in order to help you learn this autonomic regulation and visual innervation is to watch people. Watch yourself and watch movies and TV and look out for these different levels of activity and see how it kind of plays out. For example, if you're watching action movies, there's usually always a scene where someone knows they're about to die and they get clear-headed and they just fight to the last moment. At a higher level, they go into a berserker rage, right? They go into a berserker state. They're in a trance, and this helps them cut off feeling in their body. They no longer can feel pain, so they are just able to fight at a higher level without consequence of their own damage or their own body's wounds and stuff like that. Right, you may see a kid running around in the store or a mall or something, and then a sharp word from their parent, and they immediately shut down, and you can see their responses to things. Or maybe they freak out, or they're having an episode, as we tend to call it, and see how they move between different levels of nerve activity. Consciousness is a physiological product of nerve activity, both in the body and in the mind. The two aren't separated in any true degree, but they are distinct systems that have distinct mechanisms. So this same chart could apply to pretty much any vertebrate, as most of them have autonomic nervous systems and visual systems. So the evolution of this goes way back, and it's been studied that it's likely an adaptive trait more expressed or more developed in women. And this is because a hypnotizable state in this trance level over here with an autonomic nervous system that's balanced, entering into a state like a flow state for childbirth affords a level of survivability more than someone who isn't able to get into that. Martial cultures that move around a lot and are in a more suitable environment for how humans are supposed to be, or what humans evolved to be, I should say, which is being in a nomadic lifestyle. But there's a lot we could talk about this in many different aspects, like why women tend to be diagnosed with psychiatric conditions more is because they're able to get into flow states and kind of this level of excitability within their visual system. But because we have a fundamental lack of understanding of how consciousness and how the autonomic nervous system works and how the visual system works, we call these things conditions and we call these disorders, when the disorder is more so the inability to regulate through conditioning, through trauma responses, through environmental pressures, society, and the way culture is and whatnot. The way to reduce the visual innervation, to reduce the excitability of these visual nerves, is to somatically reassociate. You bring yourself out of your visual system by focusing on bodily sensations, which could include noxious stimulation. As an example, if you think about the big bodybuilders who psych themselves up and get into a trance in order to work out, they're basically putting themselves into a rage, into a berserker state. This is how they train and how they work out. They cut off any pain sensations in order to lift heavier and heavier weights. Well, what happens when you only train that? When you're outside of that trance, out of that berserker state, you tend to put yourself into more dissociative states in order to recover. Because they don't work out with somatic sensations, something like a pinch in the sort of stereotypical sense is extremely painful to them. They become very sensitive to any sort of pain outside of being in this berserker state and putting themselves into a trauma survival state. So that's it for part 2. Part 3, we'll get into the sleep activation level. And again, just continuing to talk about everything with the autonomic nervous system and visual system, kind of how it all works and the mechanisms, and continue to hash out these details. Thanks for watching.